Log Horizon is not only one of the most underappreciated anime series ever made, but in my opinion, the greatest isekai anime of all time. And I say that because it's difficult for me to imagine that it can or will be topped. It's not that I don't have a single problem with the series, but the sheer wealth of intrigue therein, and the extent to which it goes out with purpose to check off everything I could possibly want from this kind of story, makes it difficult to imagine that another show could ever surpass it without treading so much of the same ground as to look like a copycat by comparison. This is why I've chosen to describe the show as underappreciated. Log Horizon has been rightfully criticized for artwork and pacing issues, which we will go into extensive detail about in the course of this video series, but I also believe that these criticisms have been dramatically overstated as black marks on a show that's packed with so much more intrigue than the vast majority of what exists in the medium. To me at least, the idea of ranking another show more highly than this one because it nails its execution flawlessly, in spite of only attempting to do a 20th of what Log Horizon pulls off well, is asinine, especially when there are individual moments in this series executed so perfectly that I can think of whole franchises which are worth less to me than those minutes-long sequences. For clarity, in case you've never heard the term and still clicked on this video, Isekai, meaning another world, is a long-standing tradition in fiction and especially anime of characters being sent to another world and usually trying to find their way back. What exactly another world refers to is as varied as the number of stories in the genre, and there can be no shortage of narrative and thematic reasons to utilize this kind of setting. But the most common reason for anime stories to use this trope, especially in the 2010s, has been as a setup for wish fulfillment power fantasies gratifying the assumed otaku audience, that is to say hardcore fans and consumers of anime and video games. More often than not, the tenor of these stories is such that the main character is someone whose expertise in the mediums of anime and games or other nerdy hobbies just so happens to be the most useful knowledge or power in this alternate setting, allowing them to overcome the social ineptitude or loneliness that they felt back home. Many of these stories are highly self-aware about what they are, and a handful of them are quite good, especially those which use their settings to say something meaningful about human society as it is in reality, and which pose interesting challenges for the characters to overcome, not to simply have their social ineptitude washed away by the transfer to another world, but to force them to overcome it with the newfound confidence they've achieved by at least getting a foot in the door. Log Horizon has all the credentials of a story in this genre, but goes a step farther than just pushing its main character to grow as a person. After all, it features an ensemble cast of equally fleshed out humans who've been sent to another world, given that it's one of a handful of stories that goes the route of trapping the entire player base of a widely popular MMORPG inside of the game world. And even in this regard, its approach is wholly unique, but I'm getting ahead of myself already. I think the best approach to exploring every single thing which Log Horizon does well, and poorly when appropriate, is to follow the show chronologically and talk about any new thing which comes up along the way, because the series is carefully structured to dole out just the right amount of information to gradually expand both the scope of the story and the breadth of the audience's perception of it. We'll be talking about the show both from the perspective of how it functions on an initial viewing as well as how it functions on subsequent ones, on account of the fact that I think it would be unrealistic to analyze any work of art solely on the basis of how it performs in the initial viewing. If we were merely attempting to judge how well it can impress a new viewer, then that would be a different story. But in my opinion, a 10 out of 10 can only be given to a show which holds up just as well no matter how many times you watch it, and if it gets even better on repeat viewings, then that only means that its potential is further unlocked by viewing it through that lens. Unfortunately, one of the worst things that I can say about Log Horizon is that it doesn't get off to an incredible start, either in its opening scene or its entire opening arc. Neither is bad, mind you. I don't think the series ever dips in quality far enough to be considered mediocre, but neither is indicative of what I would consider to be the core appeal of Log Horizon, and could easily give first-time viewers the wrong impression of what kind of show it is. Log Horizon is first and foremost a social drama. Most of the show consists of conversations about how to build an ethical society within the paradigm of a universe which operates on video game logic. As such, opening on a high-energy action scene, and an arc which features more battles than you'll almost ever find in the show's future, doesn't exactly convey the story's purpose, and since the action choreography is average at best, it's not likely to impress an audience who would be enthusiastic to watch an action show. Nonetheless, this isn't to say that I necessarily think it was the wrong decision to make in either case. We'll get into the reason for the arc to be structured this way later, and how it makes a lot more sense on repeat viewings of the show, but the opening scene does establish some important things about the kind of story that this is, while also making it so this scene can be summarized at the tail end of the episode, going some way in making it more clear that action isn't the main form of gratification on offer here, given that the episode isn't structured around building up to a climactic action scene. The first time I watched the series, series, I remember having been initially slightly put off by the opening scene, only to later have been hooked by what comes after, and grateful that the momentum of the episode's climax wasn't slowed by an unnecessarily long action scene. But of course your mileage will vary. Most viewers probably don't hold opening episodes to the same level of scrutiny that I do anyways. Right off the bat, before we're more than 10 seconds into the show, we see a character opening up a command menu on some kind of holographic mid-air user interface, so we can assume without any introduction that this is set in some kind of virtual world, and if we know anything about MMORPGs, we'll most likely assume that this is one of them at the sight of the huge list of usable skills with cooldown timers and the main character's status screen. Attentive viewers will also notice that this character is level 90, which MMO fans will most likely rightly assume is the level cap for this game, instantly creating a small amount of intrigue in the fact that such a powerful player seems to be desperately running from what look like low-level enemies. Seconds later, Shiroi launches a spell and the camera pans a mile out to establish the setting. Even though this particular fight is taking place in a regular generic forest, we now know that this forest is next to the ruins of a modern-looking city, long mossed over in a way resembling how it is often simulated that the world would look if humanity ceased to exist and its cities became overgrown. So right away, whatever MMO game this is seems to be set in a far future post-apocalyptic world. This panned-out perspective also conveys the size of the spell's area of effect, and seconds later it's clear that this was not mainly an offensive spell, as it doesn't immediately seem to cause physical damage to the monsters, cluing us in that Shiroi is a support mage rather than an offensive one. When Shiroi then announces, "I see them, 7 briar weasels," it's clear that he used this move less as an attack and more as an element of environmental strategy. Even though this fight isn't particularly exciting from an action standpoint, this dialogue has already given it more of a tactical edge than most action shows would bother with, though I doubt that many first-time viewers would be immediately cognizant of all this because it happens so fast, and is frankly a lot of information to try and parse in the opening 20 seconds of a show when you don't even know what kind of series it's supposed to be yet. The introduction of Naotsugu and Akatsuki is once again a workhorse in getting us to understand their fighting styles inside of a couple seconds. Naotsugu is hogging the entire front of the frame with his enormous armor and the shield covering most of his body, whereas Akatsuki is minuscule and crammed into the darkened overhead of the screen, which she agilely leaps up to and crazy flips out of. You can tell that these two are a tank and a ninja instantly. Naotsugu then remarks with surprise how the enemies are tough and that he'll need to use his skill, but then his UI goes wild, letting us know that something is wrong with the game. Of course, most viewers will probably go into this show knowing at the very least that it is in fact a show about players getting trapped inside of an MMO, and will probably correctly assume that this is to indicate a difference between how things worked when this was just a computer game versus how it works now that the characters are inside of it. He screams out, "These controls suck," just to make it clear that it's not a problem of him being a bad player, but of the game being incomprehensible to him. Shiroi goes to higher ground and remarks that it's hard to get a view of the situation when you're looking through your own eyes, so at this point, even if you didn't know what this show was going to be before watching, you would understand by now. This is a game which these players are used to playing, but which is suddenly difficult now that they're living in it. After some decent action animation following Akatsuki, Shiroi then utters the single most important line in the entire show: "This isn't a game, this is our new reality." I think that a lot of viewers who find Log Horizon difficult to get into at the beginning have this problem because they overlook this admittedly innocuous seeming idea. Log Horizon is not a show about being trapped inside of an MMORPG per se. It is about coming to life inside of a different reality built out of MMO mechanics. Right from the start, the opening scene has not suggested to us that these characters simply came to life inside of their favorite game, but that the game they played has been warped into something different. The rules they're used to no longer apply, and in spite of being max level players, they're struggling against random trash mobs. As a first-time viewer, you could easily take these words as just a dramatic way of looking at the typical trapped in an MMO scenario, but when you know about Shiroi's character and the nature of the story ahead, these words have a lot more gravity. There is no question that the main reason this action scene was front-loaded into the story, both in the original light novel and the anime adaptation, was to hook the audience with some cool video game fighting and a light sense of mystery, but I think it's a lot less effective of a hook than the scenes which precede the OP. Whereas the lengthier version in the light novel goes into a lot more detail about the mechanics of what's going on, and is therefore closer to communicating the same appeal as the rest of the story, the anime version only does just enough of this in its short time to keep it from feeling too much like the generic opening action scene that I've watched entirely too many times in anime of this nature. And that is enough for me to legitimately consider it among the best of these scenes in the genre, but since I'm not a fan of them in general, it doesn't help much as a first impression.
Yeah, we are ready for the punchline. There's no use with all your gimmicks, so check this out.
Log Horizon has one of my favorite OPs of all time, and like much of what you'll see in the early part of a first run through of the show, it's something that makes a lot more sense and is way more satisfying the more of it you've seen. Luckily, whereas you might not appreciate the hidden joys of the show's first arc until watching the series again, the OP greets you at the start of every single episode, and so you'll have the gratification of recognizing more and more of what's going on just over the course of watching it once. Even seeing the OP for the first time, it's pretty obvious that all of what we're being shown is eventually going to come up in the story, but where I think it kind of fails as a first impression is in that none of these moments are necessarily enticing or impressive on their own. While I'm sure that plenty of viewers will at least have the curiosity of wanting to know what's going on in these scenes, I don't think it necessarily inspires the emotion of, whoa, I can't wait till we get to that scene, and I also don't think that this is the intent. If anything, it's more of a way to mark progress. A lot of these clips are downright major spoilers if you know what happens in them, but they're also some of the narrative and emotional highs of the series, and once you've indeed witnessed them, watching this OP becomes more and more hype. I imagine that readers of the light novels may have been excited right from the get-go to see these moments that they loved brought to life right away. Watching it again, I'm also impressed with just how extensively the series must have been planned before it went to air for the aesthetic of these scenes to have already been understood so well. Oftentimes the difference between a good anime and a great one is just the amount of time that the creative team keeps it in the oven before cutting it open. Of course, whether the OP gets you hyped with its visuals or not, the music almost certainly will, unless you just don't care for this genre. Man on a Mission provides what may very well be the single greatest upbeat nu metal song of all time, powering all in on fun schmaltz and hyperactive energy while eschewing the edginess that makes so much of this type of music embarrassing, even though this song is by all means cheesy as fuck. A lot of people might make fun of its broken-ass English lyrics, but they do make sense when you think about it. The first 4 lines and the music backing them create what I would consider the single most intense tension build and dispersal in heavy rock history, and the English communicates it without the usual cliche that native English lyricists might apply. Reading the translated Japanese lyrics, it's clear that this band is actually pretty elegant in their native tongue, and it's easy enough to decipher the aesthetic meaning that they were going for even in the broken English. Besides, the chorus is goddamn iconic, and the most obvious connection to the actual plot of the show, broad and largely tenuous though it may be. For all the praise I might heap on this OP though, I can just as easily see how it could be a massive turnoff to first-time viewers, and I even think it might be a major contributor to the common criticism of this show which I have the most disagreement with, that the character designs are less than good. We're going to go into all of the show's designs in extensive detail later, but this OP does slam so many characters on screen so frequently and so fast that if you haven't spent time with them watching the show, it feels like an overload of visual information, and that is appropriate, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. Log Horizon is set inside of an MMORPG, and most of the characters are very high level. If you've ever played one of these games, then you'll know that a big part of the appeal is crafting a highly specialized and specific character via collection of unique gear. In a lot of games, the high-level characters end up looking like they tumbled into a garbage bin full of metal bullshit, whereas others try to keep certain classes and races to a more consistent overall aesthetic. But no matter what game you're playing, if you line up a full raid party next to one another, then it's going to be pretty visually chaotic. Taken individually, I think that most of the characters in Log Horizon have really fantastic designs which complement their playstyles and personalities perfectly, and when you know who they all are, it's not such a strain on your brain to try and collect all of the images blasting by in this OP. But when it just seems like an endless onslaught of overdressed warriors, it might give the impression that the series is kind of an ugly mess, and the occasional CGI monsters certainly don't help with that impression, even though the use of CG is actually pretty tasteful in the show itself. We'll talk more about all of this later, but for now, I just want to acknowledge that this OP may have the most disparity between how it comes across on a first viewing and how it comes across by the time you're rewatching the series out of anything therein. The proper beginning of Log Horizon's story is, in my opinion, absolutely masterful, and allows us to finally address the series' structure. First and foremost, as stated before, Log Horizon is a show about building a society inside of a world that operates on video game logic. Because the characters are all taken to this world suddenly and with no explanation, there is initially no semblance of a society whatsoever, just a large number of individual players operating under their own personal logic within the possibilities realities of the world as it exists. As such, in the beginning we are presented with only a singular figure, our lead protagonist Shiroe. From here, we will form points of connection, first to other humans, one at a time. Those humans will form groups, and then the groups will meet and form societies. Eventually, societies will meet and sort out a world, and this is the overall structure of the narrative across the entire show. Of course, we won't really start to grasp this narrative flow until we've gotten well into the series, but even as a first-time viewer, the atmosphere of this introductory scene is excellent. Over the course of these videos, I hope I'll be able to sell you on the fact that Shinji Ishihara is a dramatically underappreciated director. His shows aren't dripping with visual style in the way that the best-known directors are, but he is phenomenally good at managing the pace and feeling of a scene, to the extent that many of the dialogue bits in Log Horizon are as exciting as any well-made action scene I can think of, and his ability to weave massive amounts of information into easily digestible sequences will commonly be as impressive as it was in that opening scene. While Ishihara did employ individual episode directors on nearly every episode of the series, he also storyboarded more than half of those episodes himself, and I think it's safe to imagine that his sense of visual flow is what dictated the overall pace of the series, and that he played one of the biggest roles in its planning. Our first establishing shots of Akihabara are gorgeously verdant, and I love the decision to portray this scene in broad daylight and with a fixation on the beauty of the setting, as well as the perspective of a character most likely to observe his surroundings calmly and with careful consideration. Before we ever make it to shots of people who are freaking out, a subtly intense and quietly mysterious piece of the show's phenomenal OST, combined with the pulled back camera perspective, sparse and spacey dialogue, and Shiroe's slow movement through the spacious empty streets, gives the whole sequence a dreamlike feeling that couldn't be farther from the dramatic social breakdown which most shows in this genre would be tempted to portray at the moment when the characters first appear inside the game world. For that matter, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that this show doesn't even bother starting off with establishing the world outside of the game first. We are introduced to the story at the moment when something interesting and alien to our own experience happens, and it is precisely because we start from this moment that the dramatic reveal of the first episode doesn't have to be the obvious fact that everyone is going to be trapped inside the video game. Instead, that's the baseline we're working from, and the story can get moving right away. Also unique about this show and established here is that it does not take place inside of some kind of high-tech VR game. Usually shows of this nature will either take the route of having the characters playing some kind of fully immersive MMO in the first place, so that all it takes to trap them inside is for them to be unable to log out, or otherwise simply have the characters transported to a world which is built out of the logic of the game's lore, without functioning like a literal game, so that it's clear that it's an entirely unique setting from our world. Log Horizon instead shoots for something in the middle. The characters have unmistakably been taken to a new and fully alive world, given that Shiroe can smell and feel the air, but we already know from the opening scene that there are video game UI interfaces and mechanics, so the question of what even is the nature of this setting is a huge mystery planted in the back of our minds from the start, and one which we'll be surprised to learn is still unresolved by the end of 2 seasons of the anime. I'll save the discussion of whether or not the threads of explanation that we eventually gather are interesting for when they come up in the narrative later. Requisite scenes of people scared and upset over their situations are thankfully kept to a minimum and largely regulated to the background. Thankfully, I say, not only because these scenes are typically milked for obnoxious and edgy drama in other shows, but also because they're inherently uninteresting. Anyone could predict the way that people are going to react in a situation like this, and while it's important to at least acknowledge that this reaction is happening, there would be no unique intrigue to be found in dwelling on it for too long, so we don't. Even in the small window of time that we spend with the generic masses though, there are sprinkles of intrigue. It may not be obvious on a first go-through, but one of the players is shown at one point screaming at an NPC to let him speak to the administrator, and the NPC just seems confused and afraid of this outburst. It will be another 8 minutes before the existence of NPCs is properly acknowledged, so I wouldn't imagine that all first-time viewers will actually pick up on what's happening here, but I really like that the show is willing to include moments which can be understood on multiple layers depending on how much you can piece together. Another thing I love about this scene and this entire first episode is the endless wealth of subtle foreshadowing and moments which won't mean anything to you at first, but will pay off later whether you particularly remember them or not. For instance, Shiroe randomly trips in the middle of the town square at one point, and there's no reason to think anything of it, but then when he's talking to Naotsugu later about the differences between his real-life body and the one he's inhabiting now, he explains how the height difference has been causing him to trip up. The first time I watched this show, I didn't have a clear memory of him having tripped the first time, even though his explanation of this difference made me think, oh yeah. And then when rewatching the show, seeing him trip here made me think, oh that's right, he did say he was tripping over himself at the part where he explains the height difference. Discovering little things like this has the satisfaction of watching a closed time loop or something, and there's a ton of it in this episode. My only gripe with this sequence is that there's an unusual amount of fairly generic looking background characters as compared to any other crowd shots in the show. There's still vastly more variety here than in basically any other isekai anime ever though, and I really appreciate how the big unmoving crowd shot, while artistically unappealing, actually conveys a surprising range of expressions. One guy is more locked into surprise, one dude is just gobstopped, and another guy looks totally ecstatic about realizing what's going on. Poring over the scene again and again, I just keep noticing even more subtle details, such as how Shiroe's expression changes to an annoyed look when he sees the guy screaming at the NPCs. There's literally more going on here than I can even pay attention to in one go, yet none of it is really necessary to understanding what's going on in passing. The call forwards ramp up to 11 once Shiroe opens up his friend list, and right off the top we can see members of the Honesty and DDD guilds, and Kanami listed offline, which we'll later learn is actually because she's just on another server. Even if you can read less Japanese than I can, Shiroe remarks how Toru and Minami are here too with surprise before we have any reason to know who those characters are yet or why it would be surprising to him for them to be here. Again, none of this is distracting or confusing just because the point of this scene is to establish the existence and functions of the friends list, but as a second time viewer who won't be surprised by this, it's the attention to detail and reminder of great characters to come that keeps it engaging. Before I move on to Naotsugu's introduction, I'd like to take a moment to discuss Shiroe's character design, which is pretty distinct as compared to the rest of the characters, yet strangely appropriate. Whereas most of the characters are typically seen in combat attire, befitting of their game avatar's class, Shiroe almost appears to be wearing his armor over top of what he could be imagined to have been wearing right before the apocalypse began, a black turtleneck and baggy green sweatpants. The baseline of his design is pretty much that of a stereotypical game otaku, but warped slightly, a little extra blue tint in what would most likely be black hair, a little more puff in his turtleneck than you would expect, etc. His arm and leg guards are simple cloth pieces, given that his character class isn't really meant to be seen at the front lines of battle, and by far the biggest points of emphasis are instead his enormous enchanter's cape and staff, as well as a huge waist pouch. It would not be unusual for an isekai anime to style its protagonist as a typical anime otaku, given that most of these shows are otaku wish fulfillment fantasies, and there's no doubt that part of the thinking behind this design must have resulted from the expectation that average viewers were going to project themselves onto Shiroe. But given how almost the entire cast consists of otaku in this show, I think another part of this design choice was symbolic, as was the decision to set the show in a video game version of Akihabara, commonly considered to be the mecca for otaku culture in Tokyo. Log Horizon is not just a story about forming a society in this world as stated previously, but more specifically about forming a society with this certain subset of culture at its core. As such, it is symbolically important for Shiroe to be represented as an otaku hero specifically, and not simply an otaku with the potential to grow into a great and powerful man, but one who has achieved that status already. It is ingrained into our cultural understanding of wizards that the size of their cloak and staff is directly proportional to the scale of their power and wisdom, and Shiroe's are almost absurdly massive. Given what we will eventually learn of his reputation, and what we already know about his power level within the game, it is appropriate for him to convey the image of a great sorcerer, even if he's still an otaku at the core. Naotsugu's design is extremely straightforward by comparison, but anyone with any conception of a tank will immediately recognize him as one, with the design's overall focus on broadness and the gigantic shield. I'm not sure if I think he looks like a golem just because of the Pokemon Golurk, or if this color scheme is just that common to rock monsters. Shiroe's reaction to seeing him brings about some dialogue which I'm still actually a bit confused about. He tells Naotsugu that he looks exactly like he thought he would, even though moments later he'll describe how the height difference between his real body and avatar body have caused him discordance, and Akatsuki will be revealed to have totally changed sex a couple of minutes later. On my first viewing, I had thought the implication was that the characters' real faces had been transposed onto their avatars' bodies, but this will prove untrue when we see some of their faces and memories later on, so it seems more likely that this dialogue is in reference to the much more aged and abstracted visuals of the original Elder Tale game as compared to the way things look in reality. Either way, the dialogue could have been a lot more clear. As the conversation between Shiroe and Naotsugu progresses, cluing us into aspects of their relationship with one another as well as with the game itself, we come upon one of the best cases for avoiding Crunchyroll subtitles, the incredibly important name of the Eldertale expansion pack, whose launch caused the apocalypse that trapped 700,000 people inside of the game. Whereas Crunchy's subs refer to it as the Novasphere Pioneers, the actual title, Homesteading the Noosphere, is in reference to an essay by famous and controversial software developer Eric S. Raymond on the subject of open source development. To pull a quote from the essay summarizing its conclusions as relevant to the themes of Log Horizon, "Indeed, it seems the prescription for highest software productivity is almost a Zen paradox. If you want the most efficient production, you must give up trying to make programmers produce, handle their subsistence, give them their heads, and forget about deadlines. To a conventional manager, this sounds crazily indulgent and doomed, but it is exactly the recipe with which open source culture is now clobbering its competition." Over the course of 2 seasons, we have been given only the vaguest idea of who created the apocalypse and how, but the intentions of the project are made clear by the title. By placing these otaku in a world in which subsistence is no longer a concern, as no one can truly die anymore, nor has any particular reason to do anything other than what they want to, unless for the sake of what they can receive in return, their creativity and personalities are allowed to run completely wild in creating a world that perfectly fits their unique personal needs, and achieving compromises purely on the basis of ideology instead of need. Shiroe and Naotsugu's meeting mostly stands to confirm what's been suggested by the prior scenes, and to establish our first human connection. I greatly appreciate that Log Horizon chooses to focus on a group of experienced players who know one another, as opposed to pairing Shiroe up with someone new to the game right off the bat, as it allows us to focus first and foremost on the changes between the game and this reality, as opposed to establishing the mechanics of the game itself. Given that the mechanics of this world aren't exactly the same as the original game, it would have been obnoxious to have someone constantly explaining the mechanics only to find that they've been altered, as opposed to skipping straight to that realization and letting us assume what had been true beforehand by inference. While the conversation between Shiroe and Naotsugu isn't necessarily all that interesting, it does something important for the episode's pacing, in that it pulls these characters away from the crowds for a moment, so that when they return, those crowds have moved on past the initial reactions into the phase of starting to accept things and ask questions. It doesn't take long for the thought of going out to the overworld to be floated, and for our heroes to silently understand between them what the background characters will state out loud, a fear of encountering monsters in this situation where the systems are as of yet unclear. Here we get a little taste of that visual flow which I love so much, with entertaining diegetic screen wipes which will remain a series staple, and more of those pulled back, information-dense environmental shots which lend so much atmosphere to the scene. Cutaway establishing shots to random fantasy buildings might not cause you to think much of them on a first viewing, but as the episodes go on and these buildings are flashed across the screen multiple times in passing, they slowly work their way into your consciousness so that when they eventually become the centerpieces of major story events, it feels that much more gratifying. As in other similar cases, return viewers are then excited just to see these things which they know are going to lead to important and memorable scenes later, like Shiroe pulling out his griffin summoning whistle from his bag when confirming that he has access to his items. With our experience so far having hung in this sort of dreamy, mysterious, and low-tempo atmosphere surrounding the very cerebral Shiroe, it isn't long before the more boisterous Naotsugu injects a bit of humanity and levity into the proceedings by way of his rant about the 2 types of perverts into which he categorizes all men. This is the first of many comedic scenes in this show which are likely to polarize the audience. For what it's worth, I'd be surprised if anyone particularly found these scenes to be all that funny. I certainly don't, but that's okay, because I don't watch Log Horizon for comedy, and I don't think it's unacceptable for comical scenes to exist within a show that isn't comedically driven. If anything, I think these scenes are mostly meant to break up the tension and monotony of what would otherwise be a constant onslaught of expositional conversations. In the same way that action shows will often use their story-driven scenes as a means of creating valleys of tension before it's spiked again by the next fight scene, Log Horizon uses comedy and action as means of breaking up the conversations and speeches which make up the bulk of its interesting scenes. Having said all of that, while I can defend the show's comedic scenes as not needing to be funny per se, I can't make any excuses for the subject matters used as the vehicle vehicle to deliver those punchlines. I personally don't mind the idea of Naotsugu being a flagrant pervert so obsessed with panties that he proudly proclaims his love for them as though losing control of his verbal functions, but I know why another viewer might find these breaks to be purely obnoxious and possibly even uncomfortable, especially for people who already find the pervasive insistence on comedically perverse characters in anime to be annoying or old hat. Even still though, I feel as though these kinds of scenes in Log Horizon are mostly harmful on the first impression, and much more easily defensible in retrospect. As the show goes on, we will come to realize that Naotsugu is the only openly perverted character in the series, and that his perversion never amounts to anything more than what it does at this very moment, proudly proclaiming his preference for pantsu, usually before taking a knee to the head from Akatsuki as divine punishment. Considering that Log Horizon is completely bereft of fan service, as well as any presentation of sexuality more racy than characters having feelings for one another and maybe holding hands, sexuality as a concept almost wouldn't even exist in the series if it weren't for Naotsugu's innocently perverted outbursts. While the original light novels had a little bit more subtle edge than their anime adaptation, the TV show aired on Japan's NHK network. That is, the Japanese National Public Broadcasting Channel. And this probably had a lot to do with the overall visual tone of the series being so bright and poppy, and with the decision to never delve into any imagery or ideas that might not be family friendly, in spite of the fact that the broader themes of the series dive so heavily into social politics. I'm not saying here that Naotsugu's panty outbursts are a welcome addition to the series, solely on the basis that they may have been the furthest acknowledgement of sexuality that the show could get away with on its network, but I do think that if this show with a predominantly adult cast never even acknowledged the idea of sexuality, then I would have an eyebrow to raise. Ever determined to stage scenes with a double narrative, the following segment consists of Shiroe explaining the height difference, which I've mentioned already, while Naotsugu is distracted by rocks being pelted from on high by a shadowy figure whom we've seen lurking through the background of previous world-building traversal. The scene that plays out from there is the one that bought my goodwill towards the series when I watched it for the first time, by addressing an immediate concern which I'm always furious to see other shows in the genre sidestep or fail to acknowledge: players whose avatar is the opposite sex of their own. To be honest, as happy as it makes me that the show deals with this right away, I feel like it should have been a much bigger issue among the player base. After all, I and most of the anime fans I know tend to play characters of the opposite sex, and I imagine that it's not uncommon to do so. It's possible that this really is a much bigger issue off camera, but considering that the potion which Shiroe gives to Akatsuki to change her appearance is apparently an exceedingly rare item, I worry about the huge number of players trapped in a body that they may not have preferred. Akatsuki's design is another one of the very contentious elements of Log Horizon, and a huge contributor to the opinion that the show has bad character designs on account of the fact that her hair is weird. While I did find the overlapping hair blocks a little off-putting the first time I ever saw them, I got over it pretty much immediately because Akatsuki's design is absolutely fantastic overall, and she's such a delightful character to watch. Everything about her color scheme and the look of her outfit is great, and a perfect representation of the idea of an assassin, but you could be forgiven for not even picking up on the most genius part of the whole damn outfit: the fact that it's the product of a hasty retailoring job of her original outfit, which became too big for her after transforming into her accurate body. While a lot of the components have been ditched for being unmodifiable, her pants have been rolled up and are now baggy as hell, while the sleeves of her shirt were cut off below the armpits to remove excessive fabric. Right away, while Akatsuki is a woman of few words, we get a lot of insight into her personality from the way that she speaks and moves. Her dialect is very proper and old-timey, indicating a penchant for hardcore roleplay, and her incredibly acrobatic stretching reveals not only the probability of great skill at movement, but also the expectation of needing to do so at a moment's notice. Her self-seriousness also manifests in her aggravation towards Naotsugu's perverse sense of humor, and in the most pervasive of the show's running gags: Akatsuki taking a knee to Naotsugu's face just before asking Shiroe for permission to do so. I've already given you a defense of Log Horizon's unfunny jokes, but I wouldn't be able to blame anyone for getting tired of this gag almost immediately, as it pops up constantly throughout the series, especially in these early episodes. This kind of repetitive gag is so prevalent in Japanese media that I think it could qualify as a cultural difference between Japanese and Western sensibilities, but I'm not going to make any excuses for it. The first time I watched the series, these repetitive gags were a real turnoff for me, because I didn't really know what exactly the series was going for besides an even mix of world building, action, and comic hijinks, with the later part feeling weak enough to significantly damage my impression of the show. Even though these hijinks never exactly slow down over the course of the series, when any dramatic arc comes to its climactic head, it knows to stow them away. And once the show has revealed its appeal in earnest, it's hard to be too bothered by these moments going forward or on the rewatch. Still, if there is any aspect of Log Horizon that I find myself most worried about turning people off of the show and presenting it to new fans, it is this gag. Rounding out the rest of the scene, Akatsuki pledges her fealty to Shiroi on the grounds of his assistance in fixing her body, and while the goofiness of the fact that she's so deeply engrossed in this ninja roleplay is acknowledged by the sparkles that signify her overexcitedness and the unsure reactions of the other characters, the cinematography nonetheless reflects her intensity and the importance of her pledge in how it frames her serious expression, letting us feel that, for however innocent this dialogue may seem to the characters in the moment, it is momentous in what it will mean for the story going forward. Now let me tell you, despite my reputation for cynicism and self-acknowledgement as a jaded anime viewer of close to 20 years, it did not occur to me until my third time watching this scene that it could be taken as a wish fulfillment fantasy for the audience to have a cute ninja girl pledging her loyalty to the protagonist. Even though I'm certain that this was part of Mamare Tono's intention when creating the light novels, the fact that the anime places the focus so squarely on Akatsuki and her own intentions as opposed to what this could mean for Shiroi totally sold me on the idea that her overzealous role-playing was just her identity, and it wasn't even slightly difficult to believe that someone would behave this way. Perhaps it's partially because I grew up on the internet and know more than a few people like this regardless of their sex, but my brain never once registered Akatsuki as a conveniently loyal girlfriend falling into the main character's lap, even though she totally is one. By the time the series even paints this as a romantic interest, it will have given the characters more than enough time together and legitimate reasons to feel that way, so I think they really managed to pull this character off perfectly. Continuing along, as the newly formed party converses about the increased presence of NPCs in the town, we are witness to a few more crowd shots which are significantly improved from the ones earlier in the show, perhaps as it's only now that the distinction between player characters and NPCs in the background really becomes important. It's here that I really need to take a moment to discuss the most incredible aspect of Log Horizon's visual design, the sheer number of unique character designs that appeared throughout the series. To discuss this, we really need to acknowledge just what the job of an anime character designer is, by far one of the most important roles in a show's production. A lot of people tend to imagine that a character designer just simply draws out what each of the characters looks like, and if we're talking about someone credited for original character design, such as the light novel's illustrator Kazuhiro Hara, then this would be a fair description. When it comes to the anime though, the character designer is responsible for crafting every single possible expression that the character will ever use, and defining how they'll look from every angle. A key animator's job then would be to cross-reference the character designer's reference sheets against the storyboards in order to figure out how the images are supposed to look. Whereas all of the important characters may have defined parameters by the character designer, if a storyboard calls for a whole bunch of background characters who haven't been given any specific designs, then there may be a general stylistic reference for background characters, but they're going to come out looking like an identical generic mass. Hence why a lot of shows these days just resort to creating a handful of 3D models of pedestrians and cloning them all over the place. From the perspective of expediting the production process for the staff, it's a natural decision, and as long as the audience is understanding and willing to accept it, then there isn't a problem. But personally, I consider it indicative of a glaring lack of forethought if a production comes away needing scenes like this to realize their storyboards. Log Horizon doesn't only feature hand-drawn characters in its backgrounds, but it goes a step farther and features hundreds of unique designs, which is important to conveying the actual narrative of the series. A huge part of the show's message has to do with the individuality of free adventurers, so it's not only important that they're distinct from the NPCs, but also that they're distinct from one another. Plus, it just makes sense for an MMO world to be this way. Other MMO anime have this incredibly infuriating tendency to give all of the members of a guild the same armor, as if it somehow makes sense for a group to do raids when they're all playing the same role. Log Horizon's parties and guilds look like what you'd realistically see in an MMO game, and many of the background characters look like they could be the main characters of their own stories or relevant to the plot at any moment based on their designs. Anyone with a single line of spoken dialogue will have enough thought put into them that they could have been a side character, and many of these characters will show up repeatedly throughout the series, sometimes even with multiple outfits. And if all that wasn't enough, most of these designs are also incredibly detailed. When people talk about animation quality, a lot of attention is paid to dynamism or fluidity of movement, but not a lot of people mention the actual level of detail, except when complaining about how designs become more simplistic during sakuga scenes in certain shows. Consider the following. Every single line or color on a character's outfit is one more thing whose motion needs to be tracked across every single frame of movement. A studio like Doga Kobo can get away with putting more emphasis on fluid animations because their character designs are very simplistic, whereas it would probably take twice as long to animate a knight in Log Horizon. Whether this trade-off is worthwhile will come down to a matter of taste, and obviously the optimal series would be able to have high detail and cool animation at the same time, but such a thing would be completely untenable for any TV anime to attempt more than a couple of times over the course of a production. Given the nature of Log Horizon as a show about high-level players of an MMORPG, I think that the focus on detail was easily the best decision, and while there isn't a ton of sakuga and not all of the action scenes look the best, the fact that there's any of it at all is a nice bonus, and overall it felt to me like the production was very well planned around identifying and delivering on the priorities of each scene. Before I move on from talking about design work, it's over the course of the next few sequences that we start to see some of Akatsuki's adorable expressions, which go great lengths to characterizing the commonly silent ninja girl throughout the series. I have a theory that the character designer Mariko Ito was particularly in love with Akatsuki because she not only gets the biggest variety of unique and expressive faces in the story, but a veritable wardrobe of outfits between her various choices of casual attire and all the things Henrietta makes her wear. It's also in this sequence that we begin to foreshadow what will later be my single favorite reveal in the entire show. When our heroes sit down for a banquet luncheon, they are greeted by the saddest imaginable reality. Food has no taste in this world. Over the course of the first few episodes, the tastelessness of food comes up again and again, almost like it's intended as a running joke. And the first time I watched the show, it made me incredibly sad as a big-time foodie. This was the one aspect of life in this world which caused me to think, wow, I wouldn't even want to live in that world. And it wasn't until episode 7 when it became apparent that this is exactly what I was supposed to think, and that it's kind of the entire point. But we'll discuss that more when the time comes. As we learn about instances and guilds over the next few moments, we eventually arrive at the Guild Hall of the Crescent Moon Alliance, and a huge, realistic portrait of a dog overlooking a mantle of teddy bears. While I do think Log Horizon can sometimes be accused of having stereotypical ideas of femininity, I can't say it ever has inaccurate ones. The overall color design of this room is really excellent, and its instantly homey atmosphere tells you all you need to know about the personality of the Crescent Moon Alliance as an organization. The introduction of Marielle and Henrietta is hyperactive, expressive, and fun, though just as obnoxious as any of the show's other comedy scenes. While on the one hand, I would say that this intro doesn't exactly give the best first impression of these characters, since it portrays them essentially as comic relief secondary characters more annoying than interesting, I also wouldn't say it's inaccurate to the personalities which they'll eventually develop, or that it was important to establish these characters all that well at this point in the narrative. Once again, it's a place where first and second impressions diverge. As a first-time viewer, if you don't have the expectation that these characters will ever amount to more than what they do in this scene, then you might be outright turned off by their existence, whereas second-time viewers will just feel like this is a typical meetup with a couple of old friends they've grown to know. Following the hijinks is an expositional conversation which does a slightly better job than the OP at foreshadowing a bunch of cool-looking future shit. From badass-looking characters that we'll hope to meet eventually, to epic environments full of monsters, and mysterious libraries teasing an endless wealth of lore to be uncovered. Once again, this scene is only even more exciting on the second viewing, as it hypes you up to revisit all of these cool places and people. Rounding out this scene is the reveal of Shiroe's epic history as the tactician of a legendary group called the Debauchery Tea Party, which completed many of the game's biggest challenges without ever forming a guild. It should be obvious, given what I've described about the central themes of the series and the society which the players are going to build here, how the nature of this party is something of a microcosm thereof. We'll talk more about the party later, but for now we have subtle foreshadowing that Shiroe has emotional reasons not to involve himself with a guild which need to be resolved. Up next, the characters set out to answer the biggest question that would have to be tackled in any story of this nature. What happens when you die? I really appreciate that the main characters have enough tropic knowledge about this type of story to share conjecture about whether it might be the type where you can respawn after death, or if dying in the game means you die for real. Considering the wealth of these stories, especially aimed at the same audience that this one was, it would be frankly obnoxious if either option had been treated as a dramatic revelation upon discovery. While I appreciate that there will always be audience members who have never heard of a trapped in a game story, it is also true that as soon as any of those people consume just one of them, then none of the others will ever be their first again. And the number of people who haven't even heard of the concept is constantly decreasing among any demographic besides children, so it's a lot easier for me to relate to characters when they're trying to sort out the situation based on tropic foreknowledge than it would be if they were made to pretend like this kind of story conveniently doesn't exist in a world which is otherwise the same as ours. Our climactic sequence brings us back to the flash forward at the start of the episode, but with a different tenor and tone. Whereas the original playthrough was more focused on tension and atmosphere as an action scene, this one is truncated and narrated over with a focus on how the mechanics of fighting works in this setting, thereby better reflecting the actual appeal of the series, which is unraveling the mystery of how this world functions and then finding an ideal lifestyle therein. The important detail here is the idea of usage versus mastery and planting the mystery down of the secret of how to use skills properly, but there will be better times to talk about this and anything else presented in these scenes later, so I'll hold off for now. With that, we've wrapped up the first episode of Log Horizon. On a first viewing, some viewers will likely be enticed by its interesting and unusually nuanced take on the trapped in a game story, its immediately obvious accuracy to real MMORPGs as compared to any other anime that's ever portrayed them, and the exuberant detail in its art design. This may compete with annoyance at some of the goofy humor, and a wariness towards what hasn't given us enough evidence to suggest it has more going on than any other straightforward fantasy adventure story. Return viewers will be relieved of these concerns and find their entertainment in realizing how many of the important mechanics and details were established right from the beginning, and just how much foreshadowing there is of things to come. It's not the best opening episode in anime history, but as someone who's dropped hundreds of shows within the first 5 minutes, I can confidently proclaim that it's high above average. I've tackled this episode in so much depth mostly because I wanted to establish the many different aspects of narrative and artistic design which I plan to cover in the course of this series. But since I've already given so much attention to things like the baseline character designs and the general art direction, I shouldn't need to spend quite so much time on any single episode going forward. Look forward to the second part of the series in the near future, and support me on Patreon if you want to help keep me incentivized to create it. Check out my video game analysis channel as well if you're into that kind of thing, as well as my After Dark channel where I do Let's Plays and vlogs, and the Procrastinators podcast to get in on the meta universe of me and my friends. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.